Hey guys, and welcome back for something a little bit different today. I do occasionally like doing these analysis style videos where instead of looking at a crime as a whole, we do a deep dive into a certain element or aspect of true crime. I recently did a video like this where I looked into the lead crime theory, I've done social experiments, deathbed confessions, and more. Today, I want to take a deeper look into polygraph tests, lie detector tests, and the whole concept of just uncovering lies in interrogation, how interrogators learn to spot people's tells when they're not being entirely truthful. It is very much an art, but is it an art the machines do better? Or is it an injustice to even try and compare the two? And that's what we're here to explore and ponder on today. I was actually inspired to make a video on this topic when I was invited by Crime Investigation to take part in a shoot for them, where Darren Stanton, the human lie detector, taught me and Jay Morton how to spot when the other was lying through body language and tiny little facial expressions. We played this game of truth or lie where we each had 10 envelopes featuring a few lies and the rest truths, and then we took turns being like the interrogator or the interrogated. I was so incredibly nervous for this shoot, but it ended up being so much fun, and ever since that day I found myself paying closer attention to people's little tiny microexpressions as they tell me a story. Now, every time somebody twitches their nose or is making a strange amount of eye contact with me, I find myself wondering if I'm being lied to. Also, it turns out that I myself am an absolutely terrible liar and I have tells coming out of my ears. If I make direct eye contact with you, I'm probably lying, which is now something I'm so self-conscious of. But I shoplifted from Claire's Accessories when I was 9.
Could you talk me through it?
I didn't mean to, it was a complete accident. I sort of went in and picked up something, was putting it in my hair, and then accidentally walked out with it still in my hair and nobody noticed.
So you didn't get caught?
No.
So you didn't get in trouble?
No.
What was it?
It was just a little hair clip.
Just one, two?
Yeah, one of those butterfly clips, the ones you sort of use to pull your hair back.
Why did you put it in your hair?
You just got to try it out and see if you like how it looks.
So at what point did you decide to take it without paying?
I didn't realise till I was in the car, and then I didn't tell my mum because I felt bad.
And how did that happen? How did you actually get possession of it then, if you didn't know what you were doing?
I sort of accidentally left it in my hair, so I was sort of putting things in my hair and...
So you put it on in the store?
Yeah, and I forgot it was there and then didn't realise till I was in the car and I didn't want to tell my mum.
Did your mum not recognise it?
No, she's got 4 kids, so...
I'm going to go with it's a false statement.
I agree with you. What is the truth?
It's false, never shoplifted.
Okay.
With the body language, when you're giving something true off, you tend to be a little bit more bouncy and energetic. But I think the eye contact, the eyes gave it away completely.
But I actually did really enjoy being interrogated. I enjoyed thinking on my feet and coming up with stories about these lies and learning these things about myself. However, I wasn't such a great interrogator. It is so difficult thinking of questions on the spot to try and catch somebody out in a lie, and then in the stress you also try to catch the other person's little physical cues that they're lying. Oh my god, it is so difficult. It was just such a fun day and a really great shoot. I learned so much that I can now apply to future videos when analysing interview footage of both suspects and victims, and it's come in particularly handy with writing the script for this video, so I really hope you find all of this as interesting as I have. I'm going to leave a link in the description box below for the new Crime Investigation Play app, which is the only dedicated true crime streaming service on which you can watch over 1,000 hours of true crime content on the go, with the latest UK premieres and unmissable box sets. You'll also find the link in the description box for the full Truth or Lie video that we filmed, so please do go and give that a watch as well because it was so much fun. So let's begin our investigation into the polygraph by looking at the history of the polygraph test or the lie detector test, different names for the same thing. It has a pretty long and complicated history, it turns out, starting all the way back in 1921 with a man called John Augustus Larson. Larson was a part-time police officer with the Berkeley Police Department in California, as well as a PhD student in physiology at the University of California. Through his work at the police station, studying interrogations that took place, he came up with the idea of a machine that could help officers detect when a subject was lying. But he was also a medical student, he knew how the body worked, and he knew that the body showed physical changes when a person was being untruthful. or more so I should say physical changes when a person is nervous, which could equal somebody being untruthful. These are things like changes in blood pressure, respiratory rate, and the pulse. Now, Larson wasn't the first person to make this connection between lying and these physical changes. He was actually building on the knowledge of another man called William Moulton Marston, a Harvard psychologist who had suspected that changes in systolic blood pressure could reflect whether or not people were answering questions truthfully. Fun fact, Marston was actually the creator of Wonder Woman, which is very rogue but very fun. Marston tested his theory by using a blood pressure cuff and a stethoscope to record the heart rate of test subjects, whom he would ask questions that they would have to answer truthfully or untruthfully. He started this experiment in 1915, but it was labour-intensive work. You had to carefully record and note down all the numbers, you had to pay very close attention, and it wouldn't exactly be easily applied in an interrogation situation like Larson intended to do. So, building on this knowledge, Larson invented something he called the cardiopneumocyclogram in 1921. This was a device which monitored systolic blood pressure and breathing depth continuously, marking the results on a rolling drum of smoke-blackened paper. However, Larson made a bit of a mistake when he never patented his machine. He thought this knowledge should be available for everyone. One of his protégés at the Berkeley Police Department was a man called Leonard Keeler, who worked with the police whilst he was in high school. Keeler was fascinated by Larson's invention and the possibilities it opened up, so after graduating from college, he decided to try and improve the lie detector himself. He saw all the flaws in Larson's machine, like the fact it took 30 minutes to set up and prepare, as well as how the smoke-blackened paper they would use would have to be properly treated to make sure the results would be preserved. It was very easily destroyed. So he created his own machine that he called the emotograph, and he did get it patented, meaning that he was the first American to receive a patent on such a machine, although this wasn't actually granted until many years later in 1931. However, the emotograph was actually destroyed in a fire, so Keeler found himself back at square one. Undeterred, he began creating a new machine from scratch, a better machine, building even further on the knowledge he had, and this time he had funding as well from something called the Western Electromechanical Company. This new machine was probably the kind of thing most of us will have in mind when we think of an old polygraph test. It consisted of an ink polygraph system, a motor drive, a pneumograph that would wrap around the chest of the person being questioned, and a mechanical indicator that would mark the data on graph paper. Over the next couple of years, Keeler would constantly improve upon his device, adding more elements to further test the subject. In the mid-20s, Keeler also patented an apparatus for recording arterial blood pressure, and after the patent was granted for the actual Keeler polygraph in 1931, the prototype was sold to the FBI. Many years later, in 1938, he added galvanic skin response to measure the electrical conductance of the skin, which refers basically to changes in sweat gland activity. For a lot of people, when they get nervous or they're lying, they sweat. And this would be the true birth of the polygraph as we know it today. Although whilst in theory the polygraph worked, Keeler didn't get a chance to test it out for himself for its true purpose until February 2nd, 1935, when he used his polygraph on 2 accused criminals in Portage, Wisconsin. Despite this being the first time the polygraph had ever been used for this purpose, the results were actually submitted in court and the criminals were found guilty of the crimes they were accused of. Now, I did try and learn more about these cases, but I couldn't find much information at all, not their names or their crimes, nor could I find out whether or not the polygraph results were the clincher in the verdicts here. I don't know what other evidence the authorities had against these people, but from this point, polygraphs would become more and more common as the Western Electromechanical Company manufactured and sold them to police departments across the country. Leonard Keeler would become known as the father of polygraphs, and he would eventually open up the first polygraph school, the Keeler Institute. He would also become the first full-time private polygraph consultant before quite suddenly dying aged 45 in 1949. Before his death though, Keeler had developed a questioning technique for his polygraph that was known as the relevant-irrelevant question technique. You basically ask a series of questions, some are relevant to the crime at hand, some are not. So for example, you ask their name, a simple yes or no answer that the vast majority of people will not lie about. You then ask something simple about their day routine, you chit-chat, what did you have for breakfast today? You get a baseline of the subject's levels when they're being truthful, and then you go in with the relevant questions to the crime. You sprinkle these relevant, irrelevant questions throughout the interrogation, and it worked well enough. However, in 1947, another man called John E. Reed, an ex-police officer and polygraph expert who invented the ever so questionable Reed interrogation technique, developed something else called the control question technique. This had its basis in the relevant irrelevant technique, only also incorporated control questions that were purposefully designed to be emotionally arousing for truthful subjects and less emotionally arousing for deceptive subjects. For example, you'd ask about past potential crimes that had no relevancy to the crime at hand. I feel like I'm not doing a great job at explaining these questions, but you'll have a relevant question, basically like, did you assault John Doe on the evening of June 10th? Then you'd have an irrelevant question, are you left-handed? And then the control question would be, for example, in the past, have you ever threatened to hurt anyone? It's kind of a broader question. This technique begins with a long pre-test interview in which control questions are developed on a case-by-case basis, and the examiner attempts to convince the subject of the accuracy of the polygraph. Although nowadays this pre-test interview is also used to calm the suspect as well. You have kind of got to believe that the polygraph machine works, that it's 100% going to catch you out if you're lying, for the results to be accurate. That's a big flaw of it. Like, in a perfect world, this reassurance would mean that an innocent person would immediately stop panicking if they are panicking, and a guilty person would start panicking. But as we'll come to see later in the video, that's not always the case, hence another big flaw with polygraphs in general. Moving to the early 1960s, this questioning technique is built upon even further by a man called Cleve Baxter, who developed the Baxter Zone comparison technique. In this, control questions are renamed probable lie questions, and they dealt with acts similar to the issue being investigated, but not the issue itself. So these questions were quite general, still quite vague, kind of relevant, not really. In the Baxter technique, the polygraph examiner also does not inform the suspect of any consequences that might result from a lie on the control question being detected, so the suspect is kept in the dark the whole time. Baxter also introduced a quantification system for the polygraph, kind of a score sheet if you will, generally scored from -3 to +3, making the outcomes of polygraphs less black and white, less truth or lie. There's a scoring system. And this scoring system will go on to form the basis of the numerical evaluation use in the field of polygraphs today. They're still scored in a very, very similar way. Moving through the next couple of decades, computers would become more commonplace and more understood, which, as you can imagine, lent hugely to the growth of polygraphs and the collection and analysis of data. In the late 70s, a computer is first used for polygraph chart analysis, and in the 80s, research is conducted on a fully computerized polygraph, although that wouldn't become the norm until 1993. Today, polygraphs are still computerized, and some would argue that this makes them more exact, that removing the human element has only improved them. I mean, the American Polygraph Association claims accuracy rates of over 90%, but this is disputed by a lot of people, particularly by scientists, because there are just too many outside factors, too many human factors to be considered. The credibility of the polygraph test has been debated since the day it was invented in 1921. As we've covered, the entire basis of the polygraph machine is to measure stress, so blood pressure, respiration, perspiration, all telltale signs that somebody is being untruthful, but perhaps things that most of the time aren't discernible to the human eye. And herein lies the problem, because a polygraph doesn't measure deception. There's no way to literally measure deception. It measures the things that we just mentioned, and some even argue today that there's never even been a proven scientific link between deception and perspiration, for example, or deception and heart rate. Polygraph tests as a whole are a pseudoscience, a belief or practice that claims to be both scientific and factual, but are actually incompatible with the scientific methods. There's never been any undeniable proof of the polygraph test's accuracy. It's just essentially all really good guesswork, which is not what you want when you're using these tests to convict people, to send people to prison, or even worse, to death row. If you find yourself in a situation that requires a polygraph test, the chances are that you're already going to be pretty stressed. Drawing on what I know about myself, I'm an incredibly anxious person, anxiety diagnosed since 1997. I'm a rule follower, a teacher's pet, I don't break the law, I am absolutely terrified of getting in trouble. Big problems with authority figures over here. If I'm personally in a situation where I'm being questioned as either the suspect or the victim of a crime, I know I will completely fall apart. If I think I'm in trouble or there's a chance I've done anything wrong, no matter how small that thing is, a polygraph test would show my results as off the charts. Probably due to the panic attack I'll be having. I mean, even thinking about this right now, like, my palms are sweating. You hook me up to any machine that's going to test whether I'm lying or not, my results are going to go crazy. Even with a pre-test interview, even with the examiners trying to calm and focus me, I know myself, and I know I'm not the only me out there. What happens when somebody like me with severe anxiety issues, who gets very stressed under situations like this, is accused of committing a crime we didn't do? And I say didn't do because people like me would never knowingly commit a crime. The whole idea behind having the control questions is to arouse some baseline anxiety in response to being interrogated. Those control questions are intentionally vague and hard to answer truthfully. If you didn't commit the crime, the anxiety should be lower for the relevant questions, but if they did commit the crime, these questions would trigger even greater anxiety. But not everyone is going to respond in that way. What if you're one of these people, these lucky people who manage to remain calm in every situation? Even if you are guilty of a crime, if you stay cool and collected, is your body still going to give you away? I think that's obviously the idea that yes, it will give you away, but it's not foolproof. If you compare the polygraph results between somebody like me and somebody who's very calm and collected, I'm going to come off as the liar every time, because at its core, the polygraph only tests for one thing, and that's anxiety. It's not testing for deception. You can't test for that. You can test for anxiety, or at least the physical signs of it. Controlled lab studies over the years have found time and time again that the tests are generally capable of correctly identifying liars at rates greater than chance, but it also incorrectly indicates that a lot of honest people are lying too, especially if the person being questioned is stressed, which they're pretty much always going to be. Machines cannot reflect and understand the nuances of real-world emotion, and at its core, that's the biggest flaw of the polygraph test. And then you've got the criminals, the people who really are guilty. But it turns out that it's actually pretty easy to work out countermeasures to fool a polygraph. If you've trained yourself, you can beat a polygraph pretty much every single time. Your everyday person probably wouldn't go to the effort of training themselves to do such a thing, but a career criminal is probably smart to. If you have a knowledge of how polygraphs work, it's pretty easy to manipulate them. The easiest way to do so is to simply relax, but we know that's not always possible. So instead, the best way to do so is to confuse the machine, to confuse the answers. As we've covered a lot here, control questions are there to compare to the relevant questions. So if you skew the results of the control question, it confuses the relevant questions as well. Countermeasures proven to be effective over the years have been to think about horrible, stressful things whilst answering the control questions, to bite the inside of your mouth or your tongue, to contract your sphincter muscles, or have careful control over your breathing. During the relevant questions, you can practice relaxation techniques, you can do mental calculations, or you can think about calming subjects. Anything you can do to keep your body on an even level. In 2015, a former polygraph examiner and detective sergeant called Doug Williams was actually sentenced to 2 years in prison for teaching people how to beat the polygraph. Apparently, after years and years in the field, he himself had come to distrust the results. He realised how easily it was manipulated. But it's actually a very well-known fact that you can beat a polygraph, because it's something that US government agencies, and probably many other government agencies over the years, have literally taught their undercover agents to do, just in case they're ever captured and forced to do one. It seems a bit hypocritical to me to send somebody to prison for realising the same thing that they already knew. But hey, the criminal justice system is a business after all. On top of this, there are also a lot of other factors that can contribute to false polygraph results. For a polygraph to be effective, the questions have to be properly formulated. Being a polygraph tester is a whole career in itself. It has been for many decades now. It's not like it's just random police officers hooking up suspects to machines and questioning them themselves. Formulating the questions is somewhat of an art. You've got to find the right control questions and relevant questions. They have to be easily answered. Then you've also got the risk of the examiner misreading the polygraph results, because the polygraph machine doesn't just give you a yes or no, a truth or lie answer. You've got to understand what it's telling you. If the examiner is well trained and the test is probably carried out with all the proper quality controls, your standard polygraph test is going to be between 80 to 90% accurate, but that's only for suspects. If you're interviewing victims, it's a whole different ball game. There's also the problem of drugs and alcohol as well, which can have a huge effect on polygraph results, often rendering the results inconclusive. So a lot of the times a drug test will accompany a polygraph for this reason. Over the past few decades, it's been found that polygraph tests have become less and less accurate with time. Now, it is possible that this could be a simple decrease in polygraph test accuracy over the years, but with better technology being released, as well as a better understanding of the human body, the likelihood of this is actually pretty slim. I don't think polygraphs are getting less accurate. A more likely explanation is that our estimates of polygraph accuracy have simply become more accurate. Our research understands the polygraph deeper than ever before. Nowadays we know about that 80 to 90% accuracy, as long as everything behind the scenes is 100% correct. But decades ago, polygraph examiners would have believed this number to be closer to 100%. Never exactly 100%, but much closer to that. And so for decades, many people were sent to prison across the Western world as a result of their polygraph results, following their first use by Keeler in 1935. In the USA, this was all the way up until 1998, when the Supreme Court finally made a decision ruling against polygraphic evidence in court. Interestingly, here in the UK, lie detector evidence has never been considered sufficiently reliable to be admissible in criminal law cases, due to the burden of proof. They're not 100% accurate and innocent until proven guilty. Polygraphs aren't generally commonly used over here, except for strangely in the management of released sex offenders since 2014. Extensive research coming out of the University of Kent from 2020 concluded that the polygraph is particularly effective in cases of sex offenders. So offenders are actually prohibited from refusing to take a polygraph test for up to 5 years after release on probation here. So it seems that here in the UK, polygraphs are not commonly used to detect or solve crimes, but they are used after the fact to manage the risk of an offender on the community. That's fascinating to me. They're also in the midst of a 3-year pilot programme of mandatory polygraph examinations on domestic abuse perpetrators as well. People on probation here can't be recalled to custody for failing a polygraph test, but they can be recalled to custody for making disclosures during the test that reveals they may have breached their probation conditions. If you fail the test, you can also be tested more frequently and may be given a formal warning. And if you're found to be trying to trick the polygraph or refuse to take it at all, you can be recalled back to custody. Also, interestingly, the only people who can conduct polygraph examinations here are people who've been trained as examiners by the American Polygraph Association. So you're talking very similar techniques on both sides of the pond here. Question over use of the polygraph in the USA has always been there, but it really came out into the open in 1983 with something called the Sachs Report. Leonard Sachs was a psychologist with Brandeis University who conducted in-depth research into polygraphs, and he found they weren't all that effective. He wrote, "Polygraph tests do not assess deceptiveness, but rather are situations designed to elicit and assess fear." This report led to a 1988 nationwide ban on private employers giving polygraph tests to employees. I can't even imagine that being a thing. The Employee Polygraph Protection Act prohibits most private employers from using lie detector tests either for pre-employment screening or during the course of employment. However, certain companies such as security firms and pharmaceutical manufacturers are allowed to use them subject to restrictions. And of course, places like the FBI, CIA are allowed as well. They're also allowed to be used if an employee is reasonably suspected of a workplace incident like theft or embezzlement, I suppose, in crimes. I was even more shocked to find out there's currently no legislation here in the UK at all that regulates polygraph testing for employers. But as somebody who lives here, I confirm it's not something I've ever heard of. I'm very intrigued to hear from you Americans as to whether before 1988 polygraph tests were normal in US workplaces. Was this a thing? Was it something you heard of? Or is this just something that happened, just got banned, but it wasn't really a thing before? Other countries as well, let me know if this is something that's normal in your country or not. I just focus on the USA and UK because that's where the vast majority of my audience is from. It wasn't until 10 years later, in 1998, that the Supreme Court made their decision to rule against polygraphic evidence in criminal trials because there was simply no consensus that polygraph evidence is reliable. Nowadays, polygraphs can be and very much are used in a criminal investigation in order to assist, but those results cannot be shared with the jury in court. It's been a very long history for the polygraph machine, and as we all know by now, the results should never be taken as gospel. I've been talking specifically about polygraph machines for way longer than I intended to in this video, but this was such a rabbit hole of research. Once I got started, I just couldn't stop. This was me cutting out a lot of information that I could have shared as well. This is why me and short form content just don't mix. I have so much information to talk about all the time. You're very much stuck with the long essay videos from me for quite a while here. But anyway, let's compare polygraph machines with the human mind. How good are humans at spotting a lie? Specifically trained humans, interrogators, investigators. I learned so much about this during my shoot with Crime Investigation, so I'm very excited to nerd out and share this with you all. Turns out, like I said, I'm a very bad liar. My face gives me away pretty much straight away. But I already knew that. I've never been very good at lying. Again, authority issues, I just can't lie. It's long been known by humanity that there are many external signs when somebody is lying. According to an article on Scientific American, there's an ancient Indian text from around 900 BC describing the behaviour of a prisoner. He does not answer questions or their evasive answers. He speaks nonsense, rubs the great toe along the ground and shivers. His face is discoloured. He rubs the root of the hair with his fingers. As far back as 900 BC, people clearly had tells when they were lying. In the 20th century, Sigmund Freud wrote, "He has the eyes to see and ears to hear, may convince himself that no mortal can keep a secret. If his lips are silent, he chatters with his fingertips. Betrayal oozes out of him at every pore." If you train your sense of sight, chances are that even you can begin to spot the little telltale signs of somebody telling a lie, especially if you know them well enough. It turns out that my biggest tell is eye contact, and not in the way that I thought it would be. I always kind of assumed that if you're lying, you avoid eye contact, as if the other person can see into your soul and see your lies. If you're telling the truth, you hold that eye contact, that makes sense. I generally struggle with eye contact, but it turns out I do the opposite. When I lie, I hold that contact as if I'm trying to convince the other person of my truth. When I'm telling the truth, I look around, I'm more relaxed, I look up as if I'm trying to pull from my memory. I found that absolutely fascinating. I actually did a bit more research into this, and there's a study from Mann et al. From 2012 that says if one measures deliberate eye contact rather than eye contact per se, liars have longer eye contact than truth tellers. Turns out the lack of eye contact when you're telling lies is just a bit of an urban myth. Maybe you do the same as me, maybe you do the opposite. Every single person is different, there's no universal sign of somebody lying. And this is one of the problems, I suppose, with human lie detectors. They're most likely more effective when you know the person personally, or if you spend a period of time getting to know them. The longer you know a person, the more you pick up about them, and whilst as a normal, non-trained person, I could probably, for example, pick out some of my girlfriend's tells, her little quirks, I couldn't do the same for somebody I had only recently met. Parents are also said to be crazily accurate at telling when their own kids are lying. Did you know that apparently most people tell some sort of lie in approximately 1/5 of their social exchanges lasting over 10 minutes? Do you pick up on that? Are you aware that people are lying to you? In the 1960s, Paul Ekman, a world-renowned researcher of lying and emotion, co-wrote a paper with Wallace v. Friesen called Nonverbal Leakage and Clues to Deception, which is all about nonverbal signals of lies, those physical tells. Ekman had been formulating a theory for many years around facial expressions and the correspondence to emotion. It's the basic idea that these emotions that you're trying hard to conceal are portrayed by those facial expressions and small movements of the arms, hands, legs and feet. We're talking tiny things, a twitch in the eyebrow, a corner of the mouth flicking upwards, a nose crunching up. These are something called microexpressions. Ekman has said that although these are not foolproof signs somebody is lying, they're simply an indication that something might be off. In his book, Telling Lies, he claims that truth and lies can be told apart by facial expressions alone with an accuracy of more than 80%. When body movements, voice and language were added to the mix, this reached 90%. That's the same level of accuracy as a polygraph test, but that is just one man's claims. Some argue that the same flaws of the polygraph test are valid here, that if you're being interrogated, it's at its core a highly stressful situation. Perhaps your facial movements, the tics of the arms and legs, are just a result of being there, of being afraid. I mean, when I'm anxious, I'm known to scratch and pinch at my skin. It means I'm anxious, not that I'm lying. But of course, a trained person is able to conceal their visible tells. It's all about being aware of what they are. Maybe a really well-trained person in concealing lies can throw some curveballs in there as well and confuse the interrogator. But your bog-standard person isn't going to be trained in how to do that. Most people show emotions on their face, even when they don't intend to, some more than others. Another study by Kang Lee points to something called the Pinocchio effect. When somebody is lying, blood flow decreases in the cheeks but increases in the nose. Your nose goes red essentially, which is a very physical sign of somebody lying. I would argue that this should have been called the Rudolph effect rather than the Pinocchio effect, just saying. However, when Lee presented this theory at a TED Talk, he used something called transdermal optical imaging on a photo of his son to show the blood flow during a lie. But could this just be personal to his son? If people are aware of a theory like this, are they just going to start assuming that somebody is lying whenever they have a red nose? There'd be a lot more liars in winter than in summer. But also Lee had to use transdermal imaging to show this. Is this going to be visible to the human eye? Probably not. All in all, there's said to be about 50 non-verbal signs of lying. Each person can present a different combination, any different combination of these cues. Things like gaze avoidance, pupils dilating, fidgeting, restless foot and leg movements, frequent body posture changes, changes in pitch of voice, nose twitching, and so many more. There are so many things you could be looking at that actually gets a bit overwhelming for the standard person trying to read the cues of somebody lying. Until you know where you need to be looking, how do you catch these small signs? Again, it's better if you know somebody. Speech patterns are also said to be a huge one here. Liars are proven to use more words and more complex sentences, but they make speech errors in doing so. They talk faster as if they're trying to force it out, and they repeat words or statements. They also use third-person pronouns more frequently, and they use delay strategies before answering, trying to get the story straight in their heads. False statements do tend to be hesitant and unsure when compared to true statements, and it is generally found that linguistic characteristics are more telling than body language and facial expressions when it comes to lies. But it still takes a very trained ear to pick up on these things, and at the end of the day, a confidently spoken lie is always going to seem more believable than a less confident truth, a more hesitant truth. To me, once again, I think it all comes down to the level of stress in a situation. Also, it's said that language is better to rely upon for things like this because it's easier to record language than facial expressions. A camera is never going to pick up on the minutiae. Apparently they're actually working on a computer program with facial recognition that can pick up on facial lies, but it's incredibly complicated to create. Once again though, that will be relying on computers, and how far can you rely on computers? When it comes down to it though, a recent 2019 review by Ridge et al. Concluded, the non-verbal cues to deceit discovered to date are faint and unreliable, and people are mediocre lie catchers when they pay attention to behaviour. Essentially, no reliable non-verbal cues to deception have to date been discovered. The huge study was done where there were 25,000 judgments made as to whether or not somebody was lying, based purely on body language and microexpressions. Your average person trying to detect whether another average person was lying or not. The average score out of these 25,000 judgments was just 54%, which is barely higher than chance. A 50-50 guess as to whether it was truth or lie. None of the professions that you would assume to be good lie detectors, like police and psychiatrists, had any better scores than your average person. But overall, this is something that's really hard to accurately test, because no experiment can ethically accurately recreate the same conditions under which a criminal suspect would be. In any experiment you do with truth or lie, the people being tested are always going to know that there are no repercussions to their lies, and therefore their stress levels are lower. If you're relaxed and lying, you're going to be acting a lot different than if you're stressed and lying. However, all of this is not to say that if a person dedicates their life and career to becoming a lie detector, to reading body language and facial experiments, that they can't be much more effective at detecting lies than the normal person. They very, very much can be, but it takes dedication, it takes a certain sort of eye. It is very much a career and not one that everyone's going to be good at, and even then, it's not foolproof. If you watch that crime investigation video, you'll see that even Darren Stanton, who's dedicated his life to being a human lie detector, doesn't get it right every time. He has a lot of knowledge and he knows a lot, and he gets it right a lot of the time, but not every time. An FBI agent, for example, is fully trained. They know the correct types of questions to ask. They know to go for the emotions. If somebody looks flustered, you change the subject suddenly and then return to the stressful questions when they least expect it. You can fine-tune your questioning technique in the hope that the suspect will slip up, but even FBI agents can't rely on microexpressions to tell if somebody's lying or not. For the same reason that polygraph results can't be used in court, human lie detectors, the human eye, can't be used in court in this same context either. There's just too much room for error. You've also got to bear in mind people's biases, subconscious or not, against the criminal, against the potential liar sat before them in an interrogation situation. If you don't like them, you're going to be a lot more likely to think they're lying. And nobody can read anyone's minds, but I think that's for the best. It'd be a very scary world if you could read everyone's minds. All of this brings me to one conclusion, and that's that neither polygraph tests or human lie detectors are 100% foolproof. You've always got to allow for that human element, that machines are never going to understand the nuances of human emotions, and in terms of human lie detectors, you've got to allow for human error. We are not machines. It does make me wonder though, with the two combined, do you have a higher chance of getting accurate results? If instead of training examiners in just how to use the polygraph, what if you intensively train them in how to detect lies themselves as well? What if you had a polygraph examiner and a human lie detector in the same room? But then I suppose the questions would be different. A polygraph test generally relies on simpler answers, whereas I would assume a human detector relies on stories, on the tangents, the more chances to pick up on a mistake. It's all a very interesting thought to ponder on though, isn't it? Thank you so much for tuning in for this one today. I know it's a little bit different from my usual sort. It was a little bit more personal, more of like a stream of consciousness, tangents straight from my brain kind of thing. But I just found it really, really interesting to research and think about, and I've spent a lot of time on this script. So I hope you found it as interesting as I did. Maybe I'm just a big nerd. Please do go check out Crime Investigation Play in the description box down below. Go and watch the full video from Crime Investigation. It was so interesting working with Jay and Darren on this. And I will see you guys in the next one. Bye guys.